The night Daniel Hale walked into his quiet home, he heard a trembling whisper from beneath his daughter's bed, "Dad, don't go." Before he could move, the upstairs door slammed hard, like someone unseen was waiting for him. Shadows shifted where no one stood, and the house began reacting to every step he took. What he uncovered next wasn't an intruder. It was the truth his daughter had been hiding from him for years. He set his keys down on the glass console near the entryway and paused. There was no reason to feel unsettled, yet something in the air stretched thin, almost trembling around him. Daniel had always been a logical man. Numbers, contracts, and negotiations shaped his life. Feelings rarely made it through the walls he built around himself. But tonight, he could sense something shifting in the corners of his home, something he couldn't categorize or control. The sensation made him hesitate before taking another step inside. He walked down the hallway, the soft thud of his shoes echoing a little too loudly. His daughter, Lily's door was slightly open. He hadn't seen much of her in weeks. She had become distant and silent, retreating into her room more often than not. Daniel chalked it up to childhood moods or the aftermath of the separation from her mother, but deep inside, he knew her distance mirrored something inside himself. He had drifted too far from the one person who needed him most. The consequences of that drift were beginning to reveal themselves. As he approached the room, a faint draft brushed past him, even though the windows were shut. He slowed his steps, unsure if he was imagining the shift in temperature. He pushed the door open just an inch more, letting the warm hallway light spill across the floor. Nothing seemed out of place. Lily's small bookshelf sat neatly against the wall. Her stuffed animals lined the far side of her bed. Her curtains hung still, yet something felt off, like the air was holding its breath. Then he heard it. A voice, small, fragile, struggling, rose from beneath the bed, barely audible but filled with unmistakable fear. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a call. It was a whisper meant for survival. "Dad, don't go." Daniel froze. The sound tore through every layer of rationality he depended on. For a moment, his mind rejected what he heard. Lily wasn't one to hide. She wasn't one to whisper like that. Something had driven her to seek shelter beneath her own bed, something she must have believed was more threatening than the dark itself. He felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. His heartbeat slowed, not in calm, but with an instinctual caution born from sudden uncertainty. He stepped farther into the room, letting the door ease shut behind him. His breath grew shallow as he tried to discern whether the whisper was truly hers or a trick of his imagination created by guilt and the strain of isolation. But before he could convince himself one way or the other, he heard another sound, soft, subtle, but undeniably real. It came from inside the room, close enough that it made the air shift. A gentle vibration rippled across the wooden floorboards, as if something had moved or adjusted its weight nearby. The sensation hit Daniel with a jolt. The whisper no longer seemed like an isolated moment. It felt like a warning. His instincts sharpened, urging him to search the room, to understand what had frightened his daughter enough to force her beneath the bed. But as he scanned the shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching him, responding to his movements with an awareness he had never felt before. He knelt slowly, his hand resting on the edge of the mattress as he leaned forward to see beneath it. The space was dark, too dark for a normal bedroom. The shadows under the bed seemed denser, as if absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. He squinted, trying to adjust his eyes, but before he could make out anything clearly, the temperature dropped again. A cold shiver ran along the floor, tracing the length of the room and settling at his feet. Daniel's breath caught. Something wasn't right. The air around him thickened, carrying a tension that didn't belong in a child's bedroom. He reached out, intending to lift the bed skirt and get her clear of view, but before his fingers brushed the fabric, the house shifted. A sudden creak echoed from the hallway behind him, sharp, deliberate, not caused by settling wood or shifting pipes. It was the sound of pressure being applied to a board. The sound of weight. The sound of footsteps. He straightened at once, turning toward the open doorway. The corridor outside had gone still again, but the sensation of movement lingered in the air. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting, listening, preparing. Daniel took a cautious step toward the door, his mind racing with possibilities he couldn't fully grasp. Every inch of him wanted to call out, to demand an explanation from the stillness around him, but something instinctive stopped him. Whatever was happening inside the house had unsettled Lily enough to hide. That alone made him hold his breath, forcing himself to listen instead of react. He moved closer to the hallway, and the moment his foot touched the threshold, the air shifted once more. A deep, resonant tremor pulsed through the walls, subtle but undeniable, as if the entire house was exhaling in response to his presence. It wasn't violent, it wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, like someone, or something, was acknowledging that Daniel had finally stepped closer to discovering what had been growing in the silence he ignored for too long. And just as he reached for the doorframe, bracing himself for what he might see next, the house reacted again, this time with a presence unmistakably real. The floorboard directly behind him groaned under sudden weight, as though someone unseen had taken a single step into Lily's room. Daniel Hale had always believed that a carefully constructed life could keep chaos at bay. From the outside, his existence appeared flawless. His name stood at the helm of several thriving companies, his achievements were admired by colleagues across the country, and his financial success placed him among the most influential men in New England. People often described him as a man who had mastered every aspect of his reality. Yet beneath the polished surface of admiration and respect, his world contained fractures that no amount of wealth could conceal. These cracks had been widening quietly for years, growing deeper with each moment he dedicated to maintaining the image of a man who had everything under control. The truth was that his life had begun splintering long before he realized it, and the first person to feel the consequences was his daughter, Lily. The house he had built was intended to be a sanctuary, a place where a family could flourish. He had chosen every detail with precision, from the carved banisters to the expansive windows that invited sunlight into every room. Yet despite all the beauty it held, the home often felt hollow. It lacked warmth, laughter, and the comforting familiarity that should have filled a space belonging to a family. Instead, the rooms held echoes, reminders of conversations that ended too soon, promises that were postponed, and moments that never happened because work always needed him more. While Daniel was busy shaping the world outside, the world inside his home had been quietly shifting into a place of disconnect and emotional distance. Lily, with her quiet nature and observant eyes, had absorbed these changes long before Daniel noticed them. She had become a child who flinched at sudden noises, who preferred the silence of her room over the unpredictable patterns of family life, and who learned to hold her fears in rather than risk being told her imagination was too active. Daniel often thought she was simply sensitive or introverted, traits he believed she would grow out of. He never stopped to consider that her silence might be a reflection of his own emotional absence. Her mother had tried to tell him many times that Lily needed more from him, more attention, more presence, more assurance that she was safe. But Daniel always responded with the same promise he had used for years: things would calm down soon, and then he would make everything right. The problem was that soon never arrived. The more he succeeded, the more consumed he became by the world that demanded his attention. Late nights at the office, constant travel, and endless meetings slowly chipped away at the foundation of their family. Eventually, his marriage collapsed under the weight of the life he had built. The separation had been polite, quiet, and civilized, but it left a silence behind that echoed through every corner of the house. Daniel convinced himself that Lily would adjust and adapt the way he had learned to do. But unlike him, she carried her fears without a place to put them, and their home became the vessel that absorbed them. As Daniel stood in Lily's room now, shaken by her whisper and the inexplicable presence he sensed within the house, his thoughts drifted to the subtle signs he had ignored. He remembered how Lily had paused at the top of the stairs some evenings, glancing into the hallway before making her way to her room. He recalled how she occasionally checked behind doors before entering him, brushing it off as a child's habit. Even the way she sometimes lingered near him without saying a word had been dismissed as simple attachment. In hindsight, her actions painted a picture he had refused to see. She felt unsafe. Not because of anything physical, but because the emotional security she needed from him had never been consistent. The home had begun to reflect that insecurity. Shadows pulled in corners that should have been warm. The walls seemed to carry the residue of unsaid words, arguments that never happened but should have, and the tension that arose from a family unit stretched too thin. Every room carried a weight, and Lily had learned to navigate that weight before she learned to tie her own shoes. Daniel had never realized how heavy the atmosphere had become for her, how her fears had quietly rooted themselves into her daily routines. Children sensed far more than adults gave them credit for, and Lily had sensed everything. Tonight, standing in her room with fear lingering in the air like a cold draft, Daniel finally recognized the truth he had been avoiding. The house wasn't simply quiet, it was saturated with years of emotional neglect and unspoken tension. Lily had been living in a home that felt unpredictable, not because of supernatural threats or ominous figures, but because the person she relied on the most had become a distant presence rather than a steady one. Her fear was the result of a childhood shaped by instability, silence, and unanswered questions. Yet even as these realizations settled in, Daniel couldn't shake the peculiar energy lingering in the home. What he felt tonight was different from the usual emotional coldness that filled the hallways. There was something tangible in the air, something that seemed to follow him as he moved from room to room. He didn't have the language to describe it, nor the framework to rationalize it, but he could sense the presence of something aware of him, observing him, and aligning itself with the tension in the house. It twisted around him like a reminder that the cracks in his life had grown wide enough to let something else slip through. He stepped into the hallway once more, his thoughts tumbling into one another as he tried to separate the emotional truths he had uncovered from the unsettling experience unfolding around him. The air felt thicker here, heavier with the weight of memories that had been buried beneath his ambition. As he walked slowly toward the staircase, the house seemed to listen, as if waiting for him to acknowledge everything he had ignored for years. The shadows along the walls shifted subtly, bending in ways that made him question whether they were responding to the dim lighting or something deeper threaded through the structure of the home. Just as he reached the midpoint of the hallway, an abrupt sound cracked through the stillness, a distant thud, unmistakably coming from the upper floor. The noise was sharp enough to pull him out of his reflection and jolt him back into the present. It wasn't the subtle creak of a settling house or the harmless sound of shifting furniture. It carried intention, it carried weight, and it hinted at a presence he could no longer dismiss as imagination or emotion. The house had more secrets to reveal, and this thud was only the beginning. Daniel stood motionless in the hallway, the lingering echo of the upstairs thud pulsing through the quiet house like a warning he couldn't decipher. The tension in the air hadn't eased since he heard Lily's whisper under the bed. Instead, it had thickened, pulling him deeper into an atmosphere that felt increasingly aware of him. As he climbed the steps toward the upper floor, each footfall carried a weight he couldn't explain. The house had always been still, but tonight, the stillness carried an edge, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for him to discover something he had overlooked for far too long. When he reached the top of the stairs, his attention was pulled toward a faint glow leaking from beneath the door of Lily's art room, a space she had claimed long before the tension in their home began to escalate. Pushing open the door, he stepped inside and was immediately struck by the familiar scent of crayons, paper, and childhood creativity. The room itself was small, filled with a child-sized desk, a wooden chair, and shelves stacked with coloring books she used to cherish. Yet as Daniel's eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, something in the room felt altered. The colors that once brightened the space now appeared muted, overshadowed by an undercurrent of unease. Drawings were scattered across the tabletop as if someone had rushed out mid-project, leaving behind a chaotic arrangement that didn't belong to his daughter's usual meticulous nature. He approached the table with apprehension, unsure if he truly wanted to see what Lily had been creating in the weeks he had been emotionally absent. His hand hovered over the first drawing before he finally pulled it closer, angling it toward the faint light from the wall lamp. The image on the page made his chest tighten. It showed the hallway of their home, sketched in uneven strokes with dark, heavy shading that suggested something ominous lurking just beyond the visible edges. At the center of the drawing was a tall, elongated figure standing partially hidden behind the doorway, its outline indistinct but undeniably present. The figure seemed to lean forward ever so slightly, as if observing the viewer. The unsettling detail wasn't its form, it was the way Lily had illustrated its posture, almost like it was waiting. With growing unease, Daniel picked up another sheet. This one depicted the living room, rendered with unsettling precision for a child her age. On the carpet near the couch, a small shape curled into itself. At first glance, he thought it was a toy, but the longer he stared, the more he realized it was a child's figure, drawn with trembling lines. And there, standing behind the couch, was the same tall, shadowy shape from the first drawing. Its head angled downward, directed at the small figure on the floor. The image was chilling in its simplicity, carrying a haunting quality that made the atmosphere of the room shift around him. He sorted through more pages, each one revealing a different room in the house. The dining room, the staircase, the basement door, and always, without fail, the looming figure appeared somewhere in the background, sometimes barely noticeable, sometimes dominating the scene. The drawings formed a pattern, one he couldn't ignore. They documented a presence Lily had seen, or believed she had seen, long before the events of tonight. Daniel felt a tug in his chest as he imagined her sitting at this very desk, quietly sketching her fears because she didn't know how to voice them. The thought that she had been living with this level of anxiety, never once turning to him for comfort, cut deeper than he expected. Yet something about the drawings didn't align with the life he believed they shared. Lily had never mentioned seeing anything unusual, nor had she shown signs of sensing a presence inside the house. At least, that's what he had told himself. Reviewing the drawings now, he realized she had been trying to communicate in the only way she knew how. Her silence, her distance, her sudden preference for staying in her room, it had all been a response to something building inside the house, something he had been too distracted to see. Each drawing was a fragment of her unspoken fear, piecing together a narrative he had refused to acknowledge. Daniel placed both palms on the table, lowering his head as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but his attention snagged on one drawing lying slightly apart from the others. Its placement and orientation felt intentional, as though Lily had put it aside for him to find when she no longer knew what else to do. He reached for it cautiously, already sensing this piece would carry a different weight. When he lifted it into the light, the breath caught in his throat. Unlike the others, which depicted the house from Lily's perspective, this drawing focused entirely on a single figure standing at the bottom of the staircase. The figure faced away, its posture rigid, its silhouette familiar in a way that made Daniel's pulse quicken. He studied the details, the sharp lines of the shoulders, the squared stance, the subtle tilt of the head. All of it mirrored him. The figure wasn't a faceless shadow like the others. Lily had sketched this one with precision, capturing his form in a way only a child deeply familiar with him could. And behind the figure, emerging from the darker part of the hallway, was the elongated silhouette that had appeared in every other drawing. It loomed over the figure shaped like him, almost blending into his shadow. The implication was unmistakable. Lily wasn't just frightened of a presence in the house, she was frightened of what that presence had become intertwined with. Or perhaps what it represented. Daniel stared at the drawing, feeling the truth press heavily against him. This wasn't a simple depiction of fear. It was a reflection of how Lily saw him, overshadowed by the very darkness she had been sensing. The realization hit him with an intensity that left him motionless. All the absences, the arguments that never happened but should have, the nights he returned home late without explanation, all of it had merged in her mind into something she didn't know how to separate. The looming shape wasn't an intruder. It was the embodiment of the emotional void he had created, a presence that grew each time he pulled away. As he held the drawing, letting its implications settle in, the house responded once again. A sudden, deep thump reverberated from the other side of the upper floor, resonating through the walls with unmistakable force. It was not the casual noise of a home settling. It was deliberate, heavy, and timed perfectly with the moment he understood what Lily's drawings truly revealed. Something, or someone, was waiting to be acknowledged, and it refused to remain hidden any longer. There was a time when Daniel Hale moved through the world with a sense of clarity that felt unshakable. Before the titles, before the accolades, before the weight of his success began shaping every decision he made, he had been a man driven by intention rather than expectation. People who knew him in his earlier years often described him as patient, thoughtful, even gentle, a man fully present in the moments that mattered. He wasn't always the figure who paced through boardrooms with a phone at his ear, nor the father who drifted through his home like a visitor rather than a resident. Yet somewhere along the path of ambition, the comfort of knowing someone would always listen. And he had slowly replaced that kind of safety with a different version, one that left her alone with feelings she didn't know how to voice. The person he used to be had vanished so gradually that Daniel hadn't noticed the transformation. He had traded spontaneity for schedules, warmth for efficiency, and authenticity for image. The more success he achieved, the more he felt pressured to maintain it, and the more distant he became from the life happening inside his own home. Lily had watched the shift happen, absorbing every subtle sign of his withdrawal. She saw the moments when he walked past her without noticing the way she paused to seek his attention. She felt the difference in the tone of his voice when he rushed through conversations, offering answers without hearing the questions behind them. She sensed the absence in the evenings when he returned home, exhausted, distracted, and consumed by work. The man she once ran to had slowly become someone she approached cautiously, measuring her steps to avoid disrupting the fragile balance that defined their home. Tonight, surrounded by the silence of the upper floor, Daniel felt those echoes more sharply than ever. They weren't memories anymore, they were reminders, shadows of a life he had let slip away. He walked into the room where Lily kept her belongings that no longer fit in her bedroom, items she once loved but outgrew as life around her grew heavier. Shelves lined the walls, holding remnants of a childhood that should have been filled with more joy than fear. Tiny figurines, old notebooks filled with imaginative stories, and faded artwork cluttered the surfaces. He ran his fingers along the edges of a wooden music box he had given her on her 5th birthday. The soft melody it played when opened had once filled her room with comfort. Now, when he lifted the lid, the music sounded hollow, stripped of the emotion it once carried. He felt the house settling behind him, shifting ever so slightly as if responding to his reflections. The atmosphere seemed to draw him deeper into uncomfortable truths, urging him to confront the person he had become. He thought of the arguments he had avoided, the questions he never asked, the nights he missed, the moments he rushed, and the promises he broke without realizing how deeply they affected her. A child could endure many things, but the absence of a parent's emotional presence created a void that grew with time. That void had shaped Lily's fears long before he recognized them. The drawings were proof of how she processed the world around her, quietly, diligently, and always through the lens of her own loneliness. The presence in the home tonight felt like a manifestation of everything they had ignored. It wasn't physical, it wasn't supernatural, it was the weight of years of silence pressing into the walls, echoing through the spaces they shared without ever truly occupying. The shadows weren't threats, they were reflections, reminders of the distance that grew between them. And yet, even with this understanding, Daniel sensed something else moving beneath the surface. Something more immediate, something that wasn't simply a memory or an emotion. The house had taken on a life of its own, reacting not only to his guilt but also to something stirring beneath the floorboards. He stepped farther into the room, letting the quiet settle around him. Just as he reached for one of Lily's old notebooks, intending to read a few lines she had written years ago, a sudden vibration rippled beneath his feet. It was faint at first, like the subtle tremor of distant movement, but it grew more defined with each passing second. The floorboards responded with a muted groan, shifting under his weight as though something unseen was approaching from the far end of the hallway. The sensation crawled through the wood, traveling directly toward him, each pulse mimicking footsteps drawing closer. Daniel froze, his breath catching as the vibration intensified. Whatever was moving beneath him was deliberate, rhythmic, and undeniably real. And as the sound crept toward the door, he felt the house fall silent once more, waiting for what would come next. The vibration beneath Daniel's feet faded as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a stunned quiet that felt far heavier than the trembling floorboards. His pulse remained elevated, the aftershock of the moment lingering in his chest like an unspoken warning. The house had already shown signs of shifting, drawings that seemed to record unseen presences, whispers beneath beds, sounds that mirrored movement without any visible source, but this was the first time it responded with a force that felt undeniably physical. Yet when he looked around the room, nothing appeared disturbed. Not a single item on the shelves trembled or tilted, and the soft hum of the house settled into its usual rhythm, as though the vibration had never happened. What unsettled him wasn't the moment itself but the way the silence now seemed to wait, stretching into something that felt anticipatory, like the house had paused to see what he would do next. He stepped toward the doorway, the tension in his shoulders steadying with each careful breath he drew. The hallway beyond was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a nightlight plugged into a socket near the floor, a light he didn't remember turning on. It cast a narrow line of illumination across the hallway, creating an unsettling blend of shadows and muted brightness. Daniel moved slowly, scanning the floorboards for any signs of disturbance. But each plank appeared intact, unstressed, and silent. If someone had been beneath the room or moving through the structure of the house, the evidence had disappeared as quickly as it surfaced. As he stepped fully into the hallway, the air shifted again. It was subtle, like a faint pressure drop sweeping through the second floor. The sensation drew him toward the far end where the guest rooms were located, a part of the house he rarely entered. His footsteps carried a new heaviness, propelled by equal parts caution and compulsion. Something in the atmosphere pulled him forward, almost guiding him through the dim corridor. As he neared the first door on the left, a slow creaking noise echoed from behind him. He turned, expecting to see a draft brushing against the walls or a shifted doorframe, but the hallway remained still. Yet the creaking continued, growing louder by the second, as though invisible hands were leaning against the wood and testing its resistance. Without warning, the door nearest to him slammed shut with a violent force that rattled the hinges. The impact cracked through the silence like a clap of thunder, jolting him backward. There was no wind, no open window, no logical reason for the door to move with such aggression. The suddenness of it made the air tremble, the pressure shifting as though the house had absorbed the force and responded in kind. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stared at the closed door, trying to process what he had witnessed. The slam wasn't random. There was intent behind it, a message he couldn't yet interpret. Before he had time to gather himself, the wall beside him shuddered. It wasn't enough to knock anything loose, but the vibration was unmistakable, traveling downward as though something had collided with the structure. Each pulse echoed deeper, resonating through the wooden frame like a heartbeat out of sync with his own. The walls seemed to absorb the shock, holding the tremor in place for a moment before releasing it into the floor. Daniel braced himself, placing a hand on the railing as the house settled again. He took several slow steps backward, scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. The quiet felt oppressive, thick with an energy that hadn't been present earlier in the night. It wasn't fear that rooted him in place, it was realization. The house wasn't simply reacting. It was escalating. The small disturbances, the whispers, the shifting shadows, they were building towards something more forceful. Every breath he took felt like it stirred the air around him, amplifying the tension until it vibrated along his skin. A sudden gust of cold air whipped past him, despite the absence of an open window. The rush of it was forceful enough to lift a few loose papers from a nearby table, scattering him across the hallway. Daniel turned sharply, trying to locate the source, but the temperature returned to normal just as quickly as it dropped. The cold had been concentrated, directed, as though something had passed by him rather than through the room. The sensation left him with the uneasy impression that he was not walking alone, that an unseen presence was moving through the house with a purpose he couldn't decipher. The door slammed down the hallway, this one accompanied by a deep thud that reverberated across the second floor. The sound was more aggressive than before, shaking the floorboards beneath him. Daniel tensed, his mind racing to determine if the force could be rationalized by structural issues, but the precision of each movement told him otherwise. The house wasn't collapsing or shifting under weather conditions. It was responding to something internal, something tied to the tension he had been trying to ignore for far too long. He moved forward cautiously, compelled to understand the disturbance rather than retreat from it. As he walked, he noticed faint vibrations along the railing, trailing along its length like the aftershock of a distant impact. The closer he moved toward the staircase, the more pronounced the trembling became. It wasn't steady, it came in short pulses, almost like footsteps racing above him. The rhythmic pattern made his breath catch, each vibration following the cadence of movement traveling across the upper floor. When he reached the top of the staircase, he paused, scanning the ceiling and walls for any sign of structural failure. The house remained intact, but the sensation of movement above him intensified, shifting from subtle tremors to a rapid series of thuds that traveled from one end of the second floor to the other. The sound mimicked the hurried pace of someone running through the darkness, frantic and deliberate. The hallway behind him remained empty, the shadows undisturbed, but the ceiling above carried the unmistakable imprint of movement, swift, heavy, and undeniably real. Daniel gripped the railing, his attention locked on the ceiling as the thuds converged directly overhead. The rapid movement slowed for a moment, pausing above him as though whatever was moving had come to a stop, listening as intently as he was. The silence that followed stretched long enough to make his chest tighten. Then, with a force that made his heart jolt, the final thud landed above him, sharp, heavy, and close enough to rattle the light fixture near the top of the stairs. And in that suspended moment of stillness, he heard it, something shifting rapidly in the darkness just beyond his sight, moving with unmistakable purpose above him. For the first time in years, Daniel felt every memory he had neglected gathering around him with unyielding clarity. The house, once merely a structure made of wood, plaster, and the echoes of fading routines, now felt like a living archive of moments he had brushed past without consideration. After the violent trembling, the slamming doors, and the unmistakable pressure moving above him, he stood at the edge of the staircase feeling the house settle into an unnerving stillness. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it had weight. It carried the heaviness of all the signs he had dismissed, all the subtle warnings his daughter had once tried to communicate in the only ways she knew. His mind drifted not because he wanted to escape the moment, but because the house itself seemed to push him into remembering what he had chosen to overlook. He inhaled deeply, the air stale with tension, yet threaded with something else, memory. He thought of Lily as a toddler, how she clung to him during thunderstorms, burying her face into his shoulder because the loud cracks unsettled her. Back then, he held her through every rumble, whispering reassurance until she believed she was safe. As she grew older, her fears became more nuanced, shifting from storms and shadows to things that had no name. She began pausing in doorways longer than necessary, glancing over her shoulder when walking down the hall, and insisting that certain rooms never felt right. At the time, he had chalked it up to childhood imagination, brushing past her concerns with a distracted smile before returning to his work. The memory of her hesitating outside the guest room struck him now with a sharpness he couldn't ignore. She had always lingered at that doorway, peering inside as though expecting something to emerge from the darkness. He remembered a few occasions when she insisted the room felt wrong, but he dismissed it, thinking she didn't want strangers staying in the house. He attributed her discomfort to the lingering tension of the separation, never considering that the unease she felt might have been rooted in something far more personal. He realized with an ache in his chest that she had been quietly navigating a world of internal fears without the support she needed from him. He took a slow step away from the staircase, turning toward the hallway lined with closed doors, silent witnesses to all the moments they had both endured separately. His movements felt heavier now, as if each step pressed deeper into the understanding he had avoided for years. The house seemed to absorb his reflection, its walls carrying the weight of revelations he could no longer deny. He passed by the door to Lily's room, its cracked open entrance reminding him of the whisper that first shattered his complacency earlier in the night. He could almost hear the tremor in her voice, the desperation she carried as she hid beneath the bed, whispering for him not to leave. That plea had been small, fragile, yet it had carried a history he had been blind to. He remembered the nights he promised her he would be home early, only to break those promises without explanation. He remembered the mornings he rushed past her at the breakfast table, absorbed in phone calls and emails, barely acknowledging the way she watched him with quiet longing. And he remembered the weekends he spent away, rationalizing his absence with the belief that his success would eventually make everything easier for her. But as he walked through the dim hallway now, he understood that every broken promise had built a barrier between them, shaping a version of her childhood that left her feeling more alone than safe. He paused at the wall where her earliest drawings were once displayed, colorful landscapes, cheerful stick figures, and imaginative creatures she spoke about with excitement. Those drawings had gradually disappeared over time, replaced by quieter, darker illustrations tucked away in her art room. He realized now that her artistic shift had been a silent plea, an unspoken expression of emotions she didn't know how to verbalize. Children rarely announced their fears directly, they showed them in the quiet corners of their creativity, hiding them in their behavior, hoping someone would notice. Daniel had been too distracted to pay attention, too focused on maintaining the life he believed she needed rather than the presence she craved. As he moved deeper into the upper floor, he entered a smaller hallway leading toward the guest room, a space that had always carried an unspoken tension. The air grew noticeably cooler. Here, the temperature dipping in a way that felt unnatural for a house sealed tightly against the November chill. The walls seemed to draw inward, narrowing the space around him without physically shifting. The atmosphere wasn't threatening, but it carried an unmistakable heaviness, as if the weight of everything Lily had endured had settled into the fibers of the wood. Daniel's mind replayed moments he had forgotten, times when Lily refused to enter the guest room, insisting there was something off about the air. He had laughed lightly, telling her houses made sounds, shadows shifted, and that nothing harmful lived in their walls. He remembered the discomfort that crossed her face when he dismissed her, how she stepped back slowly as though retreating from something unseen. She had learned early on that her fears would not be taken seriously, so she had swallowed them quietly, turning them into drawings and whispers instead. Now, standing before the locked guest room door, Daniel felt a prickle crawl across the back of his neck. The doorknob remained still, yet the air surrounding it felt charged, thick with an energy that didn't belong to a simple memory or emotion. The silence pressed against him, amplifying the hum of the house settling into an unfamiliar rhythm. He could feel the remnants of Lily's fear lingering here, shaping the space into something that felt suspended between reality and perception. He reached out, resting his fingertips lightly against the wooden surface. The door felt cool, almost unnaturally so, as though the temperature inside the room was several degrees lower than the hallway. His breath drew shallow as he leaned closer, listening for any sign of movement or shifting within. At first, there was nothing, only a deep, lingering quiet that settled into his ears like a low hum. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, a faint sound drifted from the other side of the door. It was soft, delicate, and disturbingly intentional. A slow, steady scratching emerged from within the locked room, as if something on the other side had awakened, not violently, but with a quiet persistence that suggested it had been waiting for this moment far longer than he realized. The scratching behind the locked guest room door grew more defined, each delicate scrape threading itself into the heavy silence that gripped the upper hallway. Daniel stood motionless, his hand still resting against the cold wood as the sound continued with deliberate rhythm. The house had unsettled him in countless ways tonight, slamming doors, shifting floors, inexplicable cold, and the haunting echo of Lily's whisper, but this was different. This was intimate, this was purposeful, and it was coming from a room he had always dismissed as unimportant, nothing more than an unused space for visitors he never had time to host. Now, that room pulsed with a history he had ignored, its very presence demanding recognition he had denied it for years. He stepped back, tension tightening across his shoulders, and felt the weight of the house settle around him again. The scratching faded abruptly, as if whatever had been making the sound knew he had moved. The stillness that replaced it was unnerving in its precision. With a deep breath, he wrapped his hand around the knob and discovered that despite being locked for as long as he could remember, the mechanism resisted only slightly before giving way under the force of his turning wrist. The lock clicked open, a soft metallic sound swallowed by the heaviness in the air. Daniel braced himself and pushed the door inward. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing a slow, drawn-out creak that filtered into the hallway like the exhale of an old memory. The room beyond was dim, the only source of illumination a sliver of moonlight leaking in from the half-obscured window. Dust lingered in the air, suspended in the pale glow like tiny particles frozen mid-motion. As he stepped inside, the floorboards responded with a low, reluctant moan, as though the room had been undisturbed for much longer than he realized. The guest room had always been simple, a bed neatly made, a dresser against the far wall, a small bookshelf that once held novels untouched for years. Yet tonight, the space felt distorted, charged with a history that had never been acknowledged. Daniel scanned the room slowly, searching for signs of an intruder, but there was no overturned furniture, no footprint in the dust, no sign of forced entry. Instead, there was something far more unsettling. The room appeared lived in, but not in any conventional sense. It wasn't disordered or messy, it was quietly altered, like someone had moved through it with careful intention, leaving the faintest traces behind. His eyes landed on the bed first. The blanket was slightly pulled back, not enough to indicate someone had slept there recently, but enough to suggest it had been disturbed. The pillow bore a faint indentation, subtle but unmistakable, as though a small head had rested there briefly. On the floor near the bed, just beneath the shadow of the frame, something caught his attention, a drawing. His breath tightened as he stepped closer, kneeling to lift the paper from the ground. It was another one of Lily's sketches. This one depicted the guest room with startling accuracy. The bed, the dresser, the narrow window, but unlike the earlier drawings in her art room, this sketch placed the dark, elongated figure not in the background but standing at the foot of the bed, looming closer than any of the previous images. The figure appeared distorted, as though Lily's hand shook while drawing it, yet the lines around the outline were strong and deliberate. What unsettled him most was not the shape itself, but the perspective from which it was drawn. It wasn't a child observing from across the room. It was a perspective from beneath the bed. From hiding, from fear. Daniel's grip tightened on the paper as an understanding washed over him, chilling in its clarity. Lily had spent time in this room, alone, frightened, and unseen. She had hidden here, either out of fear of being in her own room or because something about the guest room amplified the heaviness she felt throughout the house. The drawing wasn't an artistic expression of imagination, it was a record. A captured moment, a silent confession of a child who didn't feel safe in her own home. And now, standing in the same room she once hid in, Daniel felt that fear seep into his own skin. He rose slowly, his gaze drifting across the dresser where another object caught his eye. It was a small toy, one he recognized instantly, a wooden figure he had given to Lily when she was younger. It wasn't supposed to be here. It belonged in her bedroom, not in a room that remained closed most of the time. The sight of it felt like a whisper from the past, a reminder of the many moments she had sought comfort in objects rather than in him. The realization settled heavily in his chest, and as he traced the outline of the toy with his eyes, he felt the room grow colder. His attention shifted to the narrow window at the far end of the room. The curtains were slightly parted, allowing a thin beam of moonlight to stretch across the floor. He approached cautiously, noting that the latch on the window was unfastened. He could have sworn he always kept it locked, given how rarely the room was used. As he reached for the frame, a sudden gust of frigid air burst through the window, slamming the curtains outward with force. The entire room filled with a breath of icy wind, sharp enough to sting his skin and swirl the dust into chaotic patterns. The unexpected gust yanked the window wide open, the frame hitting the wall with a hollow, resonant thud. Daniel stumbled backward, stunned by the intensity of the cold rushing inward. The air carried with it a strange sensation, not just chill, but movement. As he steadied himself, the room fell eerily still again, yet something lingered in the breeze, a faint, distant echo woven into the cold like a remnant of sound. He listened closely, his pulse quickening as the whisper of footsteps drifted through the icy air, faint but undeniable, footsteps receding into the darkness outside, as though whatever had disturbed the room was moving away, yet not entirely gone. The freezing gust that burst through the guest room window left Daniel shaken long after the curtains settled back into stillness. He stood in the dim glow of the moonlight, feeling a cold that went far beyond temperature. It dug into him in a way that felt personal, as if the house itself had exhaled a truth he had forced himself not to acknowledge for years. When he finally stepped away from the window and back into the hallway, the air felt heavier than before, thick with a tension that didn't come solely from the strange disturbances haunting the night. Something inside him was shifting too, something he couldn't suppress any longer. The deeper he ventured into the house tonight, the more it felt like he was walking through the physical manifestation of his own neglect. The hall stretched before him in a long, narrow line, lit by faint, uneven glimmers from the night lights he barely remembered plugging in months ago. The shadows seemed to respond to his presence, receding in some places and deepening in others, as though they recognized him but were unsure whether to welcome or confront him. Every step he took awakened old memories, stirring them from the corners of his mind where he had tucked them away for convenience. The weight of those memories pressed against him with every shift of the floorboards. He didn't need the house to shake violently to feel the consequences of what he had ignored. The emotional distance he had created in his home had become its own kind of haunting. He replayed the countless excuses he had used to justify his absence. Long hours, high expectations, endless responsibilities. It was easy to rationalize a missed dinner or a forgotten. He rose slowly, his gaze drifting across the dresser where another object caught his eye. It was a small toy, one he recognized instantly, a wooden figure he had given to Lily when she was younger. It wasn't supposed to be here. It belonged in her bedroom, not in a room that remained closed most of the time. The sight of it felt like a whisper from the past, a reminder of the many moments she had sought comfort in objects rather than in him. The realization settled heavily in his chest, and as he traced the outline of the toy with his eyes, he felt the room grow colder. His attention shifted to the narrow window at the far end of the room. The curtains were slightly parted, allowing a thin beam of moonlight to stretch across the floor. He approached cautiously, noting that the latch on the window was unfastened. He could have sworn he always kept it locked, given how rarely the room was used. As he reached for the frame, a sudden gust of frigid air burst through the window, slamming the curtains outward with force. The entire room filled with a breath of icy wind, sharp enough to sting his skin and swirl the dust into chaotic patterns. The unexpected gust yanked the window wide open, the frame hitting the wall with a hollow, resonant thud. Daniel stumbled backward, stunned by the intensity of the cold rushing inward. The air carried with it a strange sensation, not just chill, but movement. As he steadied himself, the room fell eerily still again, yet something lingered in the breeze, a faint, distant echo woven into the cold like a remnant of sound. He listened closely, his pulse quickening as the whisper of footsteps drifted through the icy air, faint but undeniable, footsteps receding into the darkness outside, as though whatever had disturbed the room was moving away, yet not entirely gone. The freezing gust that burst through the guest room window left Daniel shaken long after the curtains settled back into stillness. He stood in the dim glow of the moonlight, feeling a cold that went far beyond temperature. It dug into him in a way that felt personal, as if the house itself had exhaled a truth he had forced himself not to acknowledge for years. When he finally stepped away from the window and back into the hallway, the air felt heavier than before, thick with a tension that didn't come solely from the strange disturbances haunting the night. Something inside him was shifting too, something he couldn't suppress any longer. The deeper he ventured into the house tonight, the more it felt like he was walking through the physical manifestation of his own neglect. The hall stretched before him in a long, narrow line, lit by faint, uneven glimmers from the night lights he barely remembered plugging in months ago. The shadows seemed to respond to his presence, receding in some places and deepening in others, as though they recognized him but were unsure whether to welcome or confront him. Every step he took awakened old memories, stirring them from the corners of his mind where he had tucked them away for convenience. The weight of those memories pressed against him with every shift of the floorboards. He didn't need the house to shake violently to feel the consequences of what he had ignored. The emotional distance he had created in his home had become its own kind of haunting. He replayed the countless excuses he had used to justify his absence. Long hours, high expectations, endless responsibilities. It was easy to rationalize a missed dinner or a forgotten promise when success demanded all his attention. He had convinced himself that providing financially was enough, that comfort came from stability rather than presence. But now, as he moved quietly through the hallway, the truth settled into his chest with chilling clarity. His absence had shaped Lily more deeply than he ever imagined. Each strange sound in the house, every uneasy moment she endured, was magnified by the emptiness he left behind. He paused outside her bedroom door, resting his hand lightly against the frame. The air around the doorway felt unusually still, as if the room were holding its breath. He thought of the nights she cried softly, not loudly enough to reach him in his office but just enough to echo through the walls of her own loneliness. He thought of her drawings, each one a silent attempt to capture the fear she didn't have words for. The elongated figure, the looming presence, it wasn't simply a shadow haunting the hallways. It was an embodiment of the uncertainty she felt in a home. That no longer provided her with emotional safety. The realization hit him with a force that made him lean against the wall for support. He had left his daughter alone to decipher her own fears, assuming they would fade the way childhood anxieties often did. But instead of fading, they multiplied, taking shape in her imagination and settling into the corners of the house where light rarely reached. It was no wonder she whispered for him not to go. She had spent too many nights feeling like the house was alive with something she couldn't understand, and she had no one to guide her through it. The house seemed to absorb the depth of his regret, reacting with a faint groan that traveled through the ceiling beams. Daniel straightened, scanning the upper hallway for signs of movement. It wasn't violent or abrupt this time. It felt more like a response, a subtle shift, as though the house acknowledged the truth he had finally allowed himself to face. The temperature dipped again, not as sharply as before, but enough to make the hairs at the back of his neck stand on end. The air felt charged, as though his self-reflection was stirring something embedded in the structure of the home. He moved toward the center of the hallway, and the floor beneath him responded with a soft, trembling rattle. The vibration wasn't strong, it didn't mimic footsteps or shifting weight. It felt like the house was breathing with him, reflecting the turmoil that churned beneath the surface of his thoughts. Each recollection of his absence seemed to pulse through the structure, sending ripples into the walls. The home had been absorbing unspoken emotions for years, and tonight, it was releasing them with a force that mirrored his rising awareness. As he continued forward, he passed by the wall where Lily used to tape her earliest artwork, bright colors and smiling figures that had once captured the innocence of her world. The empty wall now served as a reminder of the gradual dimming of her spark. She had retreated inward long before she hid under her bed. The drawings of shadows, the unease, the silence, all of it traced back to the void he created by being physically present but emotionally unavailable. The more he realized this, the more the hallway felt like a manifestation of every moment he had missed. The house responded again, this time with a sudden, sharp crack along the ceiling. The noise ricocheted through the corridor, startling him enough to halt mid-step. He waited for another sound, but none came. Instead, an oppressive quiet settled over him, pressing against his ears. He felt the weight of the house watching him, urging him forward, as though there was more he needed to see, more he needed to confront before the night unraveled into something he couldn't control. He took another step, then another, until he reached the long stretch of hallway connecting the bedrooms to the staircase. The moonlight filtered through the window near the stairs, casting a pale glow across the floor. As he stood in this narrow cross-section of the house, the atmosphere shifted again. This time, it wasn't a vibration or a tremor. It was movement, swift, fleeting, and unmistakably human in shape. A shadow flickered across the far end of the hallway, stretching briefly along the wall before disappearing into the darkness. Its form was sharp enough to recognize yet distorted enough to send a jolt through him. What unsettled him most wasn't the movement itself but the familiarity of its shape. The broad shoulders, the stance, the height. For a moment, he felt as though he was staring at a distorted reflection, one that moved independently of him, shaped by the very absence he had allowed to take root in his home. The shadow lingered at the edge of his awareness, haunting in its resemblance. As it dissolved into the darkness, the air tightened, leaving him frozen in place. The hallway fell still, but the echo of the figure remained, waiting in the quiet for him to understand what it represented. The shadow that flickered across the hallway left Daniel rooted in place long after it dissolved into darkness, its uncanny resemblance lingering in his mind like a truth he wasn't yet ready to accept. The house felt impossibly quiet now, as if it were gauging his next move, waiting for him to acknowledge the message woven through every tremor and shifting shadow. His pulse steadied slowly as he forced himself to breathe. Whatever moved through the home carried a history he had neglected for years, and the house seemed determined to reveal that history piece by piece. He stepped forward cautiously, letting the dim moonlight guide his path. The hallway opened into a wider landing where the ceiling angled sharply downward, forming a space beneath the attic crawl. He had passed this area countless times without a second thought, treating it as nothing more than an awkward architectural corner he never bothered to use. Tonight, however, something about the space felt different. The air seemed denser here, as though memories had seeped into the walls and settled into the crevices over time. Each step he took across the landing made the wood groan softly, as if the house were whispering reminders of moments long buried beneath his routine. A faint draft brushed against his ankles, unusual for a house with sealed vents and closed windows. Daniel paused, feeling a subtle shift beneath the floorboards. It wasn't the rhythmic. The house responded again, this time with a sudden, sharp crack along the ceiling. The noise ricocheted through the corridor, startling him enough to halt mid-step. He waited for another sound, but none came. Instead, an oppressive quiet settled over him, pressing against his ears. He felt the weight of the house watching him, urging him forward, as though there was more he needed to see, more he needed to confront before the night unraveled into something he couldn't control. He took another step, then another, until he reached the long stretch of hallway connecting the bedrooms to the staircase. The moonlight filtered through the window near the stairs, casting a pale glow across the floor. As he stood in this narrow cross-section of the house, the atmosphere shifted again. This time, it wasn't a vibration or a tremor. It was movement, swift, fleeting, and unmistakably human in shape. A shadow flickered across the far end of the hallway, stretching briefly along the wall before disappearing into the darkness. Its form was sharp enough to recognize yet distorted enough to send a jolt through him. What unsettled him most wasn't the movement itself but the familiarity of its shape. The broad shoulders, the stance, the height. For a moment, he felt as though he was staring at a distorted reflection, one that moved independently of him, shaped by the very absence he had allowed to take root in his home. The shadow lingered at the edge of his awareness, haunting in its resemblance. As it dissolved into the darkness, the air tightened, leaving him frozen in place. The hallway fell still, but the echo of the figure remained, waiting in the quiet for him to understand what it represented. The shadow that flickered across the hallway left Daniel rooted in place long after it dissolved into darkness, its uncanny resemblance lingering in his mind like a truth he wasn't yet ready to accept. The house felt impossibly quiet now, as if it were gauging his next move, waiting for him to acknowledge the message woven through every tremor and shifting shadow. His pulse steadied slowly as he forced himself to breathe. Whatever moved through the home carried a history he had neglected for years, and the house seemed determined to reveal that history piece by piece. He stepped forward cautiously, letting the dim moonlight guide his path. The hallway opened into a wider landing where the ceiling angled sharply downward, forming a space beneath the attic crawl. He had passed this area countless times without a second thought, treating it as nothing more than an awkward architectural corner he never bothered to use. Tonight, however, something about the space felt different. The air seemed denser here, as though memories had seeped into the walls and settled into the crevices over time. Each step he took across the landing made the wood groan softly, as if the house were whispering reminders of moments long buried beneath his routine. A faint draft brushed against his ankles, unusual for a house with sealed vents and closed windows. Daniel paused, feeling a subtle shift beneath the floorboards. It wasn't the rhythmic vibration from earlier, nor the rapid tremors that mimicked footsteps. This was gentler, like a small exhale of air rising from beneath the surface. He crouched instinctively, running his fingers along the edge of the board. The wood felt cool, almost unnaturally so, and the faint outline of a seam caught his attention. He pressed lightly, feeling the board shift just enough to confirm that it wasn't properly secured. He hesitated before prying his fingers beneath the edge, unsure what he would find but compelled by a force beyond curiosity. The house had been guiding him all night, pushing him toward truths he had ignored, and something in his gut insisted this was part of that unraveling. With a steady pull, the board lifted slightly before giving way entirely, revealing a narrow gap beneath the floor. Dust rose in a soft plume, illuminated by the faint glow from the hallway light. As the air settled, Daniel leaned closer, his gaze adjusting to the darkness beneath the floorboards. What he found there froze him in place. The narrow cavity beneath the landing was filled with small objects, not random debris or forgotten trinkets, but items that belonged to Lily. He recognized the little keychain she used to attach to her backpack, its once bright colors now dulled by dust. Next to it was a hair clip she wore almost daily when she was younger, the one she used to beg him to fix for her before school. There were crumpled pieces of paper tucked into the corners, their edges torn and worn. He reached for one carefully, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was a drawing, another one, but this one was different. It wasn't a depiction of a room or a shadowed hallway. It was a picture of Lily herself, curled beneath what looked like the very floorboards he was peering into now. She had drawn herself small, tucked tightly against the wooden beams, her figure almost swallowed by the darkness around her. What struck him hardest was her expression, simple lines forming a face filled with fear, eyes wide and searching. The drawing felt intimate, like a confession she had hidden away, hoping someone would find it only when she no longer had the courage to speak her truth. Daniel sifted through the other papers, each one revealing more of her inner world. Some drawings showed her hiding beneath different parts of the house, the staircase, the guest room, her own bed. Others depicted the elongated figure, sometimes far in the background, sometimes looming so close its outline nearly consumed the page. The images weren't random sketches, they were a timeline of her growing fear. Each drawing seemed to represent a moment she felt unsafe, unseen, or overwhelmed by something she didn't understand. He felt a crushing tightness in his chest as he realized how long she must have been hiding these pieces of herself deep within the structure of the home. She had created her own refuge beneath the floorboards, a place where she could store the parts of her heart that felt too heavy to carry alone. The idea that his daughter had quietly crafted a secret archive of her fear made his stomach twist with a guilt that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't childish fantasy. This was the emotional map of a child trying to survive the silence of her own home. He reached deeper into the cavity, his hand brushing against something rigid. He pulled out a small notebook, its cover worn and stained as though it had been handled repeatedly. When he opened it, he found pages filled with short, fragmented sentences, lists of sounds she heard at night, moments when the house felt different, times she felt something watching her. Each entry was dated. Some went as far back as 2 years. A wave of nausea swept through him as he realized how much she had endured without him noticing. He thought back to the nights he arrived home late, stepping quietly into the house while she lay awake, listening for comfort that never came. He imagined her slipping out of her room, creeping to this very corner, lifting the floorboard with her small hands, and hiding another piece of her fear where no one could find it. How many times had he walked across this landing, unaware of the secrets lying just beneath his feet? He sat back slowly, overwhelmed by the weight of the discovery. The house had been carrying her burden long before tonight. It had absorbed her fear, her silence, her loneliness, until those emotions seeped into the structure itself. Everything that had happened tonight, the slamming doors, the shaking walls, the echoing sounds, felt like the house trying to release everything it had held for her. Daniel closed the notebook gently, his breathing uneven as he held the truth in his hands. For the first time, he understood the depth of the emotional chasm between him and his daughter. It wasn't simply neglect, it was years of unspoken fear growing roots in the very foundation of their home. Before he could gather himself to stand, a sudden, violent impact shattered the silence. It echoed through the hallway like a strike of thunder, originating from a room he recognized. Instantly, Lily's room. The force of it vibrated through the floorboards beneath him, sending dust scattering as if the house itself recoiled from the sound. The impact was strong, unmistakably deliberate, and it carried a chilling message. Something had happened in Lily's room. The impact from Lily's room echoed through the upper floor long after the vibrations faded, its force lingering in the stillness like a warning meant only for him. Daniel rose slowly from the landing, his hands trembling around the worn notebook he had found beneath the floorboards. The pages inside held truths he should have uncovered years ago, yet they were only glimpses of something deeper, something that had shaped Lily in ways he was only beginning to understand. The weight of everything he had just discovered pressed against him as he moved down the hallway, each step carrying a heavy recognition that her whisper earlier that night, "Dad, don't go," had come from a place far more complicated than fear of the dark. He reached her bedroom doorway cautiously, bracing himself for something catastrophic. The room was dim, illuminated by the muted glow of her small nightlight shaped like a cloud. It cast a soft light across the floor, barely reaching the dresser or the far wall. At first glance, nothing. He reached deeper into the cavity, his hand brushing against something rigid. He pulled out a small notebook, its cover worn and stained as though it had been handled repeatedly. When he opened it, he found pages filled with short, fragmented sentences, lists of sounds she heard at night, moments when the house felt different, times she felt something watching her. Each entry was dated. Some went as far back as 2 years. A wave of nausea swept through him as he realized how much she had endured without him noticing. He thought back to the nights he arrived home late, stepping quietly into the house while she lay awake, listening for comfort that never came. He imagined her slipping out of her room, creeping to this very corner, lifting the floorboard with her small hands, and hiding another piece of her fear where no one could find it. How many times had he walked across this landing, unaware of the secrets lying just beneath his feet? He sat back slowly, overwhelmed by the weight of the discovery. The house had been carrying her burden long before tonight. It had absorbed her fear, her silence, her loneliness, until those emotions seeped into the structure itself. Everything that had happened tonight, the slamming doors, the shaking walls, the echoing sounds, felt like the house trying to release everything it had held for her. Daniel closed the notebook gently, his breathing uneven as he held the truth in his hands. For the first time, he understood the depth of the emotional chasm between him and his daughter. It wasn't simply neglect, it was years of unspoken fear growing roots in the very foundation of their home. Before he could gather himself to stand, a sudden, violent impact shattered the silence. It echoed through the hallway like a strike of thunder, originating from a room he recognized. Instantly, Lily's room. The force of it vibrated through the floorboards beneath him, sending dust scattering as if the house itself recoiled from the sound. The impact was strong, unmistakably deliberate, and it carried a chilling message. Something had happened in Lily's room. The impact from Lily's room echoed through the upper floor long after the vibrations faded, its force lingering in the stillness like a warning meant only for him. Daniel rose slowly from the landing, his hands trembling around the worn notebook he had found beneath the floorboards. The pages inside held truths he should have uncovered years ago, yet they were only glimpses of something deeper, something that had shaped Lily in ways he was only beginning to understand. The weight of everything he had just discovered pressed against him as he moved down the hallway, each step carrying a heavy recognition that her whisper earlier that night, "Dad, don't go," had come from a place far more complicated than fear of the dark. He reached her bedroom doorway cautiously, bracing himself for something catastrophic. The room was dim, illuminated by the muted glow of her small nightlight shaped like a cloud. It cast a soft light across the floor, barely reaching the dresser or the far wall. At first glance, nothing seemed overturned, nothing broken, But the room was not the same. The air had changed. It felt thicker, colder, filled with the residue of a disturbance he hadn't witnessed but could sense in the way the dust still floated unsettled in the air. He stepped inside, scanning every corner, every shadow, every familiar detail that now felt foreign. Her bedspread was slightly askew, pulled back just enough to indicate movement. The edge of her rug had curled as though something brushed against it with force. Her shelf of stuffed animals remained in place, but one of them, a small, faded rabbit she held onto since infancy, had toppled onto its side near the foot of the bed. These were not signs of violence. They were signs of fear. Signs of someone leaving the room quickly, desperately, without wanting to be followed. Daniel's breath tightened as he approached her bed. The memory of her whisper returned with brutal clarity, the tremble in her voice, the urgency layered beneath the simple plea. He crouched, lifting the bed skirt slowly, half expecting to find her hiding the way she had hours earlier, but the space beneath the bed was empty. Nothing but shadows and a thin layer of dust greeted him. For a moment, a hollow sensation spread through him, the realization settling like cold stone in his chest. She wasn't here. He sat back on his heels, pressing a hand against the floor as though grounding himself against a truth he didn't want to accept. Her whisper hadn't been about a single moment of fear. It was the culmination of everything she had endured alone, every strange sound, every shifting shadow, every emotionally empty night when he wasn't there to comfort her. "Dad, don't go," wasn't a plea for safety in that moment. It was an echo of hundreds of nights she wished for him to stay, wished for him to listen, wished for him to notice the fear growing inside her like a shadow she couldn't escape. He stood, scanning the room again, searching for any hint of where she might have gone. His gaze landed on the wall beside her dresser, where dust had settled thickly along the floor. A faint trail cut through it, barely noticeable unless someone was looking for it. He knelt again, examining the markings closer. The dust was disturbed in a narrow line, as though small feet had moved hurriedly across it. The trail continued toward the door, then curved sharply to the right, disappearing into the hallway. A surge of urgency pushed him forward. He followed the trail out of the room and into the hallway, where the pattern grew more visible in the soft moonlight, a thin line carved through dust that had been undisturbed for far too long. It led past the stairs, past the guest room, and toward the far end of the hallway where the house dipped into a darker corner. This part of the house always felt colder, not because of faulty vents or drafts, but because it held memories he had avoided acknowledging. The trail of dust continued toward a small door near the floor, the one he rarely noticed because it blended with the wall paneling. It wasn't a room he used often. It wasn't a room anyone used. It was the narrow storage space that led down to the basement staircase, an old design feature from the original blueprint of the house, a place he had only entered once during renovation. The door was closed, but dust had been brushed away from the bottom edge, forming a faint arc that suggested it had been opened recently. His breath hitched as he reached for the handle. The coolness of the metal stung his skin, sharper than any temperature in the house should have been. He hesitated only a moment, listening to the heavy silence pressing against the walls. The house seemed to hold its breath with him, as if waiting for him to accept what he would find next. When he finally pulled the door open, the hinges groaned under the strain of movement they hadn't endured in years. The staircase leading downward was steep and narrow, the wooden steps disappearing into darkness below. A faint draft drifted upward, carrying with it a dusty, stale scent that hinted at abandonment and silence. Yet beneath that, something else lingered, a faint shift of air that suggested movement. Daniel's pulse quickened, a mixture of dread and determination tightening in his chest. Lily had gone down there. She must have. The trail of disturbed dust made that clear. But why? What could have driven her to retreat into the one part of the house that felt colder than any other? He paused at the threshold, gripping the edge of the doorframe as he tried to steady his thoughts. Lily's whisper echoed again in his mind, stronger now, layered with the weight of every moment he hadn't understood. She hadn't been warning him about a presence he imagined. She had been begging him to stay because she feared what would happen if he didn't. The truth behind her trembling plea had nothing to do with one night of terror. It was the accumulation of years of emotional distance, silence, and loneliness she could no longer carry alone. Daniel took a slow step onto the first stair. The wood creaked beneath his weight, resonating through the narrow passage. As he descended, the air grew colder, the shadows thicker, the silence louder. His hand traced the rough wall for support, his eyes adjusting to the darkness 1 inch at a time. The trail of disturbed dust continued downward, disappearing into the shadows below like a path he had no choice but to follow. And as he reached the midpoint of the staircase, something shifted in the darkness beneath him, subtle, distant, and unmistakable. A movement, a sound, a presence. Lily was missing again, and the trail she left behind pointed directly toward whatever waited in the basement. The basement staircase felt narrower than Daniel remembered, as though the walls had closed in over the years, tightening around secrets that had settled into the foundation of the house. He descended slowly, each step sinking deeper into an air that felt damp with the weight of everything unspoken. The deeper he went, the more the temperature dropped, pulling at him with an almost physical force, a cold that felt less like climate and more like consequence. His hand skimmed the rough wall for balance, the surface gritty beneath his fingertips, layered with years of dust and neglect, mirroring the emotional history he had long ignored. The dim basement light flickered weakly from somewhere overhead, casting intermittent shadows that stretched and shrank across the walls like fractured memories. The trail of disturbed dust continued ahead of him, unmistakable in its clarity, guiding him with the unsteady line of a child's hurried retreat. Lily had come this way recently, far too recently. The idea that she descended into this cold, forgotten part of the house in fear or desperation made Daniel's chest tighten with a guilt so heavy it nearly stopped him mid-step. He had spent years running from the emotional truths he didn't want to confront, but now those truths had crystallized into something far more tangible, lurking in the spaces his neglect had created. As he stepped off the last stair and onto the basement floor, the silence pressed against him with suffocating weight. This wasn't the silence of a still house. It was the silence of a place that had absorbed years of unspoken pain, laid into its beams, breathed into its walls, and settled into its shadows. The basement was cold, but beneath the coldness was something else, an emotional residue he could almost feel against his skin. He scanned the room, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light. Boxes lined the walls, covered in dust-heavy sheets. Old furniture leaned against each other in crooked stacks, forming shapes that seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally in the flickering light. Daniel's gaze traveled to the center of the basement floor where the dust had been disturbed more heavily. Small footprints, Lily's, crisscrossed the space, some overlapping, others stopping abruptly as though she had pivoted in fear. He moved closer, studying the patterns with a trembling breath. The footprints didn't wander aimlessly, they followed a path that curved toward the far end of the basement where the shadows deepened into near blackness. The sight chilled him, not because the shadow was unfamiliar, but because something about its depth seemed to beckon him, as if it held the truth he had avoided confronting for years. The emotional monster he had created had not appeared overnight. It had taken shape slowly, built from every absence, every ignored plea, every rushed interaction that left Lily feeling small and unseen. What he had witnessed throughout the night, the slamming doors, the trembling floorboards, the shifting shadows, was not the work of something supernatural. It was the manifestation of years of fear that had festered quietly within the home. Children internalized far more than adults realized, and Lily had internalized everything. The house, almost alive with the weight of those unspoken emotions, seemed to pulsate with a life born from that very neglect. He moved deeper into the basement, guided by the faint footprints and the oppressive stillness that settled thicker with every step. As he walked, the flickering light above dimmed once more, then steadied weakly, illuminating the room in uneven shifts. He felt as though he were walking through a memory, one he had never witnessed but had unconsciously contributed to. The basement had become the physical embodiment of everything he tried to bury within himself, the guilt, the distance, the emotional failure that had shaped Lily's small, trembling world. He reached a point where the footprints grew faint, blending into the darker dust as though she had slowed, uncertain or afraid. His breathing grew shallow as he followed the path to the farthest corner of the room. There, the shadows pulled into a dense darkness that seemed to stretch farther than the physical boundaries of the basement. The air here was colder, cutting sharply into his lungs with every breath. It felt like he had stepped into the very heart of the tension that had been building throughout the night. A faint hum pulsed through the space, so subtle he almost mistook it for his own heartbeat, but the vibration moved through the ground, trembling lightly beneath his feet. It felt like the house itself was exhaling, releasing the pressure of years of emotional weight. Daniel stood still, letting the heavy silence settle into him. He was not afraid for himself. His fear lay wholly in the fact that Lily had come down here alone, driven by emotions she didn't know how to process, seeking safety in the last place it could ever be found. He crouched near the last clear set of footprints, running his hand along the floor where the dust had shifted. The prince was small, fragile, and filled with the innocence he had failed to protect. He closed his eyes for a moment, the truth settling heavily into his chest. All of this, the whispers, the drawings, the fear, had been her way of trying to make sense of a father who had drifted too far from her emotional world. She had been left to interpret the silence and shadows alone, creating monsters out of the spaces his absence left behind. When he opened his eyes again, the darkness at the far end of the room seemed to pulse, almost imperceptibly. He rose slowly, the hairs at the back of his neck standing on end. The shadows shifted, not with the flicker of the light, but with intention, as though something within him stirred at the recognition of his arrival. The air grew colder still, a tightness pulling across the room in a way that made the silence feel alive. Daniel took a single step toward the darkness, compelled not by curiosity but by responsibility, a responsibility years overdue. The presence in the shadows seemed to acknowledge his movement, the faintest ripple slicing through the darkness like a silent response. And then, at the farthest corner of the room, something shifted with slow, deliberate movement, as though the darkness itself was turning to face him, finally acknowledging his presence. The moment the darkness at the far end of the basement stirred, Daniel felt something shift inside him, something that had been dormant for years. The air around him thickened, no longer simply cold but weighted with the culmination of a truth he had been circling all night. This house, these shadows, the trembling whispers carved into its walls, they were not warnings of a physical threat. They were echoes of something far more human, far more devastating. Everything that had happened throughout the night, every shifting wall and rattling floorboard, was the manifestation of a fear that had grown inside his daughter for years, fueled not by monsters or intruders, but by the hollow spaces he had left behind. He stepped forward cautiously, straining to see through the dense blackness that pulled deeper in the corner. The flickering basement light barely reached this part of the room, leaving it suspended in shadow, but Daniel no longer feared what lay ahead. Instead, he feared what he might find missing if he didn't face it. His neglect, his emotional absence, his failure to show up. For the small, everyday moments that mattered, those were the true forces shaping the atmosphere of the home. Lily's fear was not born from darkness but from the emotional void left in the wake of his unintentional abandonment. The realization pressed against him with a heaviness that was almost unbearable. The house had not turned hostile. It had simply begun mirroring the silent turmoil Lily endured alone. Each slamming door represented a moment she felt unheard. Each trembling vibration echoed the anxiety she swallowed without anyone to soothe her. The cold drafts carried the chills of nights she lay awake, listening for footsteps that never approached her door. Every shadow that stretched unnaturally along the walls was the loneliness she tried to outrun by hiding in corners, under beds, or here in the basement, any place where she felt her fears might shrink if she stayed small enough. Daniel's breath trembled as he stepped farther into the darkness, guided by the faint shuffle he had heard earlier. His eyes strained to adjust, searching for any sign of movement, any silhouette that might reveal where Lily had gone. As he approached the far wall, the dim light behind him caught the faint outline of something small near the ground. He leaned forward cautiously, feeling the cold intensify around him, the kind of cold that hinted not at danger but at the lingering residue of emotional wounds that had never been healed. He knelt, brushing aside the thin layer of dust. There, pressed against the wall, was another drawing, smaller and creased, as though it had been held tightly in Lily's hands before she tucked it away. He unfolded it delicately, bracing himself for the weight of what he might see. The drawing was simple, a small figure representing Lily standing in the center of their home. Around her, the walls were filled with swirling lines, dark, heavy strokes that looked like storms. But beside her stood another figure, drawn faintly at first glance. When he looked closer, his breath caught. It was him, but unlike the earlier drawings where his form was overshadowed by a looming presence, this version of him stood upright, facing Lily. His outline was incomplete, unfinished, as though she didn't know how to draw that version of him because she hadn't seen it in so long. Yet the intention was unmistakable. Lily had imagined what it would feel like if he stood by her, not behind shadows or distant hallways, but beside her, steady and reassuring. The drawing trembled in his hands, the lines carrying an innocence that pierced him deeply. This wasn't just fear, it was longing. Quiet, desperate longing for a version of her father she remembered vaguely but needed desperately. He swallowed hard, the weight of her childhood silently playing out before him in fragments of crayon and pencil. As he rose, a soft scuff echoed through the darkness. It wasn't abrupt or threatening, it was subtle, almost hesitant, like the shuffle of small feet dragging lightly across the floor. He turned toward the sound, a surge of frantic hope pressing through him. Lily had to be here. She had come down these stairs seeking something: safety, escape, understanding, and the choice he made in this moment would determine not only how the night ended, but how their lives moved forward from here. The basement seemed to pulse with the gravity of that realization. The air pressed in, thick with years of silence they both had endured in different ways. Daniel took a slow step toward the sound, calling her name softly, not demanding, not desperate, but present. The name floated into the darkness with gentle intention, different from every rushed call he made in the past when time was short or patience thin. This time, the sound carried weight, meaning, a promise. The shadows ahead shifted again, subtle but undeniable. He felt the floor beneath him tremble with the faintest vibration, as if the house itself felt the importance of this moment, as if it were pushing him toward a truth he had run from for too long. Daniel's eyes strained, desperate to locate her shape among the darkness, his breath shallow with both fear and hope. He stepped closer, each footfall a vow not to retreat, not to leave her again. The darkness seemed to thin just slightly, the faint outline of movement becoming clearer. He sensed her before he saw her, a small presence curled into the corner, the air around her heavy with a tension he had caused without ever intending to. The realization carved through him with painful clarity. This was the moment everything collided. His past mistakes, her unspoken fears, the house that had contained them both. He understood now that the only real threat in this home had never been an external force. It had been the fear Lily carried from growing up in a world where love existed without presence, where reassurance was replaced with absence, and where safety was something she had to create on her own. Daniel took one final step toward the sound in the dark, his heart pounding with the awareness that what he chose to do next would become the defining moment of their lives. The darkness seemed to shift in response, revealing the faintest shade beginning to emerge. And in that breath, suspended between past and future, he realized that the final decision he made tonight would either repair his family or destroy it forever.